What is project finance? Project finance is a structure that supports the long-term financing of infrastructure projects based on cash flows generated by the project rather than the balance sheet of its sponsors. Simply put, the debt and equity used to finance the project are paid back from the cash flows generated by the project. In order to ring-fence the project's cash flow and financial obligations, including its assets, a special purpose vehicle is created. An SPV is a separate legal entity which can carry on even if its owner or parent company goes bankrupt or cannot perform its obligations. Sponsors are shielded from lender recourse, and this structure allows risk to be allocated to the appropriate counterparties through contractual agreements. Project finance has been used for hundreds of years. It was initially used in mining and natural resource contracts. Governments can use project finance to keep project debt and liabilities off their balance sheet and use that freed up fiscal space for other spending. For governments looking to attract foreign direct investment and private sector participation in the generation of electricity, project finance is a solution that has allowed independent power producers and public-private partnerships to raise significant capital to build, own, and operate power projects. The advantage of this approach is that the host government minimizes an upfront capital outlay and instead commits to the long-term purchase of power generated through a PPA. Project finance requires a complex set of highly tailored agreements that allocates risk, costs, and rewards across multiple counterparties. Depending on the complexity, project finance structuring can add transaction costs and time to project development, delaying execution. In extreme cases, there are projects which would still not be able to attract cost-efficient financing based on perceived or actual project risk. Risks may be considered too high, returns not proven, or returns not commensurate with risk. As a result, some DFIs who have technical assistance, advisory services, or pools of concessional resources at their disposal have created procurement platforms. These procurement platforms try to de-risk project development in a fashion to mitigate real or perceived risks that would otherwise lead to higher costs, delays, or impede project from happening. There are several stakeholders who are direct counterparties or involved in the development and assessment of a project. This includes developers, equity investors, lenders, EPC contractors, equipment, and fuel suppliers. The list can go on. But at its essence, there are 4 or 5 main building blocks. First, in the center, a special purpose vehicle project company is established. The sole activity of the company is to carry out the project. The project company enters into a PPA with an off-taker, which defines the main and often sole revenue stream and source of repayment. The off-taker is often government or state-owned or controlled. To the right, the project company subcontracts most construction and operations-related activities through construction, equipment supply, and operations contracts. Sponsors can include financial and strategic investors as well as developers who invest equity either as cash or shareholder loans into the project company. Project lenders can include commercial banks, multilateral and DFIs, export credit agency, capital markets, and institutional investors, to name a few. These parties can provide a variety of instruments from loans, guarantees, to insurance to mobilize the amount of financing your project can support. Lender's primary source of repayment is the revenue generated from the PPA. Their recourse, if there are shortfalls in debt service, is the underlying project asset, including performance and completion guarantees and bonds or revenues owed to shareholders. Finally, governments may provide direct support for a project through subsidies or grants, including fiscal incentives, generally through an implementation or concession agreement. In some cases, if the off-taker is not sufficiently creditworthy, lenders and investors will require other forms of credit support from government to provide a financial backstop to support ongoing payment or termination obligations under the PPA. We'll briefly touch on this form of credit enhancement in the next couple of slides. Bankability. This is the crux of project finance. What is it? A project is considered bankable if lenders and investors are willing to finance it. To a lender, this means ensuring that from a technical and commercial perspective, there is sufficient visibility and comfort that the project will generate sufficient cash flow to service its debt obligations. For an investor, bankability means that during operations, the project will yield optimal returns within an identified investment horizon. For both investors and lenders, the PPA represents a key project document which underpins the commercial viability of a project and therefore the basis of a project finance. The PPA defines all commercial terms for the sale of electricity, including when the project will begin commercial operation, schedule for delivery of electricity, payment terms, and termination date. Some of the elements both parties will want to ensure are covered to their right. This includes that there is a fixed tariff or purchase price of power that is both affordable and still adequately covers the project's fixed operating costs, repays the debt, and an agreed equity return. The PPA should set out clearly the basis on which either party may terminate the PPA, that the terms within the agreement are shielded from changes in law and tax, which could have an adverse impact on the project's economics, and finally should address dispatch risk, force majeure, currency, and assignment rights, and other important features which will need to be reviewed to determine whether a PPA is truly bankable. Over the last couple of decades, more investors and international lenders have looked to support countries' transition to greener economies, as countries have set ambitious targets to increase the percentage of renewable energy in their generation mix. Many emerging markets are still developing the enabling environment, including physical infrastructure, policies, and regulations to support greater renewable energy generation. Added costs to mitigate intermittency through storage solutions or getting equipment to project sites requires higher tariffs for projects to be bankable. While renewable energy projects have lower OPEX than thermal projects because they have no fuel costs, they have historically had higher upfront CapEx costs, which has also required higher tariffs to repay lenders and investors. Higher generation tariffs increase the cost of generation in the system, which ultimately the end user will pay for, either directly or indirectly, if the electricity sector is subsidized by government. DFIs have looked to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy technology. They've used climate funds and other donor-backed facilities to help lower the cost of finance to help incentivize the transition to renewable energy. Moving back to the topic of credit support, credit enhancement, and credit worthiness. The bankability of a PPA is only as good as the ability of both parties, the seller and the buyer, to hold up their contractual obligations under the agreement. The ability of the off-taker to purchase the amount of electricity it is committed to at the scheduled time it is supposed to make that payment is an important part of establishing the off-taker's creditworthiness. If lenders are concerned with the off-taker's short-term liquidity position, and therefore its ability to make ongoing payment obligations, they may require additional letters of credit or standby facilities which can be drawn on if the off-taker is late in making scheduled payments. These are typically 3 to 6 month revolving facilities with the expectation that the off-taker will top up or replenish the account to keep it available throughout the life of the loan. If the facility or standby instrument is exhausted, it can trigger an event of default and termination. In that event of an unexpected project termination, lenders will want to ensure their outstanding principal and interest are repaid. If the off-taker's creditworthiness and financial health are questionable, lenders will often look to an explicit undertaking from government to guarantee termination support. This can be through an explicit sovereign guarantee, a put-call option agreement, a support letter, or sometimes addressed in an implementation or concession agreement. A direct agreement is between lenders and the off-taker, assuring that lenders will be notified in the event of a project company's default, and gives them the right to intervene before termination of the PPA. Direct agreements also include provisions such as step-in rights to allow lenders to take over control of the project company, extend cure periods, and bring in other contractors to remedy a potential default. So in this chapter, we've covered 3 key terms: project finance, bankability, and off-taker credit support.